Here's a question for you. If the world started to fall apart tomorrow, where would you go? Most people think of New Zealand or a mountain in the Swiss Alps, but there's another place that you might want to consider. Okay, I want you to imagine a place so tucked away, in the vast blue ocean of the Pacific, that for most of human history the rest of the world didn't even know it existed. No trade routes, no warships, and no missionaries. Just an island sitting halfway between Australia and Hawaii. That island is Nauru, and for over 3,000 years, it was exactly what it looked like from the sea. Very peaceful. Want to know why? Well, because the Micronesian settlers who first arrived around 1000 BC built something unique. Over generations, they grew into 12 distinct clans, each with their own chiefs, their own traditions, and their own rules. And for the most part, it worked. But let me set the record straight here. Yes, there were tensions between clans. Yes, there were dry seasons when the island's only water barely stretched far enough. Life here was not without its struggles. But hey, the island held, and it's still very much alive, though just when things were shaping up. On November 8th, 1798, a British ship called the Hunter crested the horizon. The captain's name was John Fern, and he was en route to the China Seas. He wasn't really looking for anything in particular, when suddenly, there it was, an island, and within moments, hundreds of Nauruans were paddling out to greet him in canoes. Captain Fern didn't let his men disembark. The Nauruans didn't board either, but there was a kind of understanding that passed between them. So Fern, charmed by the green plateau, the swaying palms, the white sand beaches, and the welcome itself, decided to give the island a name. He called it Pleasant Island. Yes, you could say it was a very fitting name. But it was also, in retrospect, a prophecy that the island would spend the next 2 centuries trying to outrun. Of course, the trouble didn't arrive all at once. It rarely ever does. It first started with beachcombers. You know, convicts and deserters washing up on Nauruan shores in the 1830s, trading what they had for what the island offered. They brought alcohol. They brought rifles. And slowly, like a river flowing to the sea, those things changed everything. By the 1870s, guns were in homes across the islands. Nauruans were drinking heavily, and when a chief's son was accidentally shot dead during a quarrel at a wedding festival, something broke. Retaliations. Counter-retaliations. Neighbours killing neighbours. What had once been managed tension became 10 years of open war. It took German intervention in 1888 to finally stop all the fighting. Though I must admit, stop might be a generous word, because in reality the Germans annexed the island, and in doing so they set the stage for what was coming next. So, what did happen? Well, in 1899, a geologist named Albert Ellis was sitting in a Sydney office when he noticed that there was a rock propping open a door. He'd been told it was fossilised wood from Nauru, which was then spelled Mauru on some maps, but it really wasn't wood. It was phosphate ore, a high-grade, valuable material that could supercharge fertiliser production across an entire continent. 2 years later, Ellis sailed to Nauru and confirmed what he suspected. 80% of the island, which the locals called topside, was sitting on a fortune. So naturally, the Pacific Phosphate Company decided to mine it in 1906. From then on, Nauru's fate was being passed around like a trophy. Australia captured the island from Germany during World War I. That's when the British Phosphate Commission was formed. It was a joint venture between the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. During this time, hundreds of thousands of tons of phosphate began leaving Nauru's shores every year. And get this, they were priced well below market value to subsidise farmers in Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. Which means essentially the island was being sold to build the agricultural empires of other nations. And what did the Nauruans get? Well, they received tin royalties while their land received practically nothing. Then came World War II. Here's what happened. Japan invaded in 1942. Then it was a series of beatings, forced labour, mass deportations to the Cook Islands, and executions. Over 400 Nauruans died, including almost every Nauruan deported who didn't survive the harsh conditions. And by the end of the war, there were fewer than 600 that remained on the island. To make matters worse, Australia returned around the same time. And with them, the mining resumed. By 1968, when Nauru finally gained independence, 1/3 of the island had already been stripped bare. The Nauruans were living on a narrow coastline, which was essentially the skeletal remains of a landscape that had once been green and lush and very much alive. Because of this, Australia offered to relocate the entire population to Curtis Island off Queensland. Give them citizenship, a fresh start, a new home, you know? But the Nauruans said no. This was their island. Their ancestors were buried here. Their identity was rooted in this very soil. So they stayed. And they chose independence. Okay, by now we have the gist of how Nauru came to be. But do we actually know what it looks like? No. Good thing we're talking about geography next. So let me transport you to Nauru. Picture the Pacific Ocean. Yes, all that vast, almost incomprehensible stretch of blue that covers a third of the entire planet. Now zoom in. Keep going. Further. Past Fiji. Past Kiribati. You're almost there, to that tiny green dot, barely 21 square kilometres. Or just about 8 square miles. That's Nauru for you. It's the third smallest country on Earth by land area, and one of the most isolated places a human being can actually live. The whole island is ringed by a narrow coastal strip, stretching maybe 300 metres, or about 1,000 feet, inland before rising onto a central plateau the new ruins call Topside. And if you've been paying attention in our history lesson, you know that's actually the phosphate zone. Before the mines, Topside was where the birds once nested and the ancient hardwood trees grew. But after a century of machines tearing it open to look for treasure, it now looks like a lunar landscape. A jagged forest of exposed limestone pinnacles where the soil used to be. And there's no escape from that view, because Nauru is just one solid piece of land. There are no scattered atolls or confusing chains of islands here. It's just one self-contained chunk of coral and limestone, ringed by a jagged reef that's wrecked more than a few ships over the centuries. That reef is actually why Nauru historically had no major seaport. For 100 years, they had to use massive steel arms, basically giant diving boards, to reach out over the waves to load ships. It wasn't until very recently that they finally built a modern deep water port to connect them to the rest of the world. And because the island is so small, it only has a single main road. There's one paved ring road that circles the entire island, and since it's only 19 kilometres long, or a little less than 12 miles, you can drive the whole country in about 20 minutes. I mean, there's one airport and exactly one traffic light. And let me tell you, that traffic light, its main purpose isn't to stop cars for other cars, it's to stop traffic so that commercial jets can cross the road to reach the runway. Now, considering how small this country is, there is technically no official capital city. Most maps point to Yaren in the south, which acts as the de facto capital, because that's where the parliament and the airport are. But don't get me wrong, this entire country isn't just one big town. It's still divided into 14 distinct districts, and scattered among those districts are about 12,000 people who call Nauru home. In terms of visitors, it doesn't get a lot, usually fewer than 200 tourists a year. Meaning, if you ever plan on booking a flight here, you don't have to worry about crowded streets or sold-out hotels. Which, by the way, I've linked some info for you below. And while you're at it, be sure to add this to your itinerary. Buada Lagoon. It's a landlocked emerald green lagoon right in the heart of the island, surrounded by the only fertile soil left on the interior. Though, if you want a little more adventure, I suggest heading to Anibare Bay. The reef there is one of the most vivid scuba diving spots in the entire Pacific, with a massive underwater drop-off that'll take your breath away. So, if you ask me, that's definitely a must visit. For some people, however, Nauru isn't just a pit stop or a vacation destination. For some people, it's a plan B. Back in late 2025, Nauru launched something called the Economic and Climate Resilient Citizenship Program. It's essentially a citizenship by investment scheme that allows you to apply for a no-ruin passport by making a direct financial contribution to the country's treasury. And when I say a contribution, I'm talking about $115,000 for a single applicant. If you're bringing family, it's an additional $20,000 for a spouse and $15,000 for each child or sibling. But up until June 30th, 2026, the minimum contribution is reduced to $90,000. I can see the gears turning in your head. You're thinking, why Nauru? Well, the timing isn't a coincidence. Just look at the state of the world right now. Conflicts are escalating. Governments are talking about reinstating conscription, and capital restrictions are tightening. For a lot of families watching this unfold, the question has shifted from, do I need a second passport, to, why don't I have one yet? It's a safety net. And what's drawing people to Nauru isn't luxury or five-star resorts. It's neutrality. Nauru has no military entanglements and no political axes to grind. In a world that feels like it's constantly picking sides, being a citizen of a tiny, neutral dot in the Pacific is worth a lot. And what makes this program different is how inclusive it is. While other countries have mountain-high stacks of fine print and age restrictions on who counts as a dependent, Nauru keeps it simple. You can apply as a broad family unit, but don't think it's easy. While the entry barriers are straightforward, the due diligence is intense. Every applicant goes through a gold standard vetting process involving international police and third-party agencies. They aren't just selling a document, they're protecting the integrity of the passport. But here's the most interesting part, where the money actually goes. Every dollar from these applications flows into Nauru's Economic and Climate Resilience Fund. Nauru is currently ranked by the UN as one of the 5 most climate-vulnerable nations on the planet. They are literally fighting against rising tides and intensifying storms. So, in a strange way, when someone buys into this program, they aren't just buying security for their own family, they're buying time for an island that's running out of it. When you look at it that way, it's actually a win-win for everyone. And by everyone, I'm also referring to the people who actually call this place home. Look, on Nauru, a child's name is a map, and that map is drawn by the mother. It sounds like a riddle, but it's the core of their survival. Here, identity is a matrilineal inheritance. That means every Nauruan is born into one of 12 original clans, represented by the 12 points on the star of their national flag, and that blood thread is passed down from the mother, not the father. It doesn't matter who you marry or where you go, that clan affiliation never shifts. And just so you understand the weight of that, in a Nauruan household, the eldest woman is the most respected voice in the room. It's not the father or the son, it's the matriarch who is the law. In a world that usually looks the other way, that's a power structure you don't see every day. Besides that, you know what else Nauruans do differently? If you're walking the beach at sunset, you'll see fishermen standing against the tide with a Nauruan lasso, coiled in their hands. I know what you're thinking. They're probably just going to catch some fish. But you'd be dead wrong. If you watch closely, they're hurling those lassos skyward to catch frigate birds. And they aren't catching them for food either. They bring them home and keep them as pets. It's one of the oldest, most unique sports on the planet, and it's still practiced today exactly as it was 1,000 years ago. Of course, that's one of many Nauruan traditions that still exist today. Another is called the Iruwa. It's a rhythmic, heavy chant that carries the same spirit and intensity as a New Zealand haka. But if you stay long enough, you realise the real story behind Nauruan culture isn't just about what's being preserved. It's about the fight to keep it from disappearing. Honestly, there's a real disconnect happening right now. On one hand, you've got young Nauruans who struggle to read or speak their own language. On the other, you've got ancient songs where the melody survives, but only the elders still remember the lyrics. Even Constitution Day has mostly turned into a day for track and field, while the document itself, aka the thing that actually guarantees their freedom, hardly gets a mention. Yeah, you get the picture. There's an entire generation growing up knowing exactly what was taken from their island, but they're fighting to hold on to what was left behind. And yet, this isn't a goodbye, it's a reclamation. You see it in students staging cultural pageants in traditional dress, and youth parliament members pushing for real laws to protect their heritage. That's because they realise, maybe more than anyone, that when everything else is gone, your identity is the one thing you can never let go of. So, if you are in the same boat, what's that one thing in your culture that you will fight for? That one thing you want passed down for generations to come? Write it down in the comments. I'm genuinely so curious. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.